Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday here on August the 30th. Wow, what a crazy weather week it was these past few days. Tuesday brought us high heat and straight line winds that blew down trees and even some corn and beans as it made its way across the mitten. Silage corn seemed to be most at risk, especially those with big ears and tall stalks, but with the wind came some appreciated rain, though it probably came faster and harder than we might have requested if we had that option. The good news is that we collected a lot more heat units, but those days above 86 degrees really didn't add a lot to the value of our overall corn development. Now, speaking of heat units, let's take a minute and check in with MSU's EnviroWeather site for this past week. The data shows our crop progress continuing to be ahead of normal by about 2 to 4 days ahead of that 5-year average. Now, specifically in the East Lansing area, we've collected 2131 heat units or 26 heat units above the 5-year average. Over in West Michigan, Allegan, 2,192 heat units or 26 above the 5-year average. Jumping down to Southeast Michigan, that Deerfield, Blissfield area, 2,327 heat units, 62 above the 5-year average. Up in the Thumb, Sandusky area, 2,075 or 63 heat units above that 5-year average. And wrapping up in that north central Ithaca area, 2,274 heat units or 69 above the 5-year average. Now, what's really interesting is that if you look at this year as compared to last year, where we were way behind in heat unit accumulation, you would see that we're actually 12 to 18 days, or about 2 weeks ahead of last year's season. So the good news is that next week looks to be more moderate for temperatures and, mostly sunny for the week. So hot topics this week included questions around how far our crop is from maturity, a deep dive into the cost of harvesting soybeans when they're too dry, and what things actually influence kernel depth development in corn. So let's break each of these topics down, discuss the actions we can take either this year or next to kind of remedy these issues. So first off, let's talk about how we figure the number of days until harvest for silage, for grain corn, and for soybeans. So as for corn, we need to determine what stage your corn is in. Most corn in Michigan is somewhere in the dent stage. Now, it takes 300 heat units to go from the start of the dent stage to half milk line. And then it takes an additional 220 heat units to go from half milk line to that black layer or physiological maturity, about 32% moisture corn. So as for silage corn, the old adage, of course, was always just to look at the kernels and see when they reached half milk line and your silage would be ready to harvest. Now today, we all know that it's much more about whole plant moisture and is kind of dependent on how you're going to plan to store that silage too. But my biggest concern or watch out for this year is to not get behind. This crop is developing fast, and I've already heard of folks starting to take silage beginning days ago. So therefore, this is probably not the year to wait until after Labor Day to start thinking about silage harvest, unless you planted late or you tend to plant some pretty full season silage hybrids. As for grain corn, we need to do the math. So right now, we're accumulating about 15 heat units a day. Therefore, if you break open some ears and happen to be at that half milk line point, the math would tell us that black layer should occur in about 2 weeks. That would be that 220 heat units needed divided by 15 heat units per day. So, of course, as we continue to get more fall-like temperatures, we'll gain less heat units each day, which might lengthen this closer to 3 weeks away. Either way, I suspect we'll have a lot of corn past that critical black layer point prior to October 1st this year. As for soybeans, remember that they develop course, based on day length and not heat unit accumulation. Therefore, the fuller the bean maturity, the more days it's going to take to hit full maturity. Now, for soybeans, full maturity is considered to be that R8 growth stage. This is when 95% of the pods on that plant have reached their mature pod color. Now, this is still 10 to 15 days away from hitting that 15% moisture for harvest. Now, today, most of our beans are more like in the R6th growth stage or full seed. I'm just starting this week to see fields start to turn color, which means we're nearing our 7 growth stage, that time when we can see one normal pod on the main stem reach its mature pod color. So we aren't there yet, but once we do get there, it usually only takes a week to hit R8. In other words, we should be into bean harvest in 3 to 4 weeks, depending on planting date, field conditions, and, of course, variety maturity. So, second, let's talk and take a few minutes to talk about the soybean harvest moisture. There's actually some extensive value to harvesting our beans a little wetter, like that 14% moisture. According to our Golden Harvest Agronomy in Action research, maximum yield decreases quadratically at harvest moistures below 14%. So, in fact, in a 70 bushel yield environment, we found that you can successfully harvest 97% of the crop at 14% moisture, whereas if you wait until 12%, it drops to 93% for your maximum yield, and at 10% moisture, you're down to 88% of your maximum yield. So finally, if these beans get down to 8%, you're only harvesting 80% of your maximum yield. So this is primarily due to shatter lost at harvest. In fact, if you look behind the combine and see just 4 soybeans per square foot of area on the ground, this equates to 1 bushel per acre yield loss. Not to mention, we deliver soybeans to the elevator based on total weight. And the lighter weight of over dry soybeans is leaving money on the table that we just can't afford to lose with the current commodity prices. Therefore, as you're planning your soybean harvest this fall, just be extra aware of the harvest moisture and utilize those overnight moisture accumulations each day to your greatest advantage. So finally, let's talk about one of the lesser discussed components of corn grain yield, that kernel depth. So when we look at the formula for figuring corn yield, this is the part that influences the number we divide by. So traditionally, we take the number of rows around times the number of kernels long times the number of harvestable ears in a thousandth of an acre and divide that all by 90. But what if it only takes 80,000 kernels to make up that bushel, or better yet, 70 or 75,000 kernels to make up that same bushel? Our yields actually increase dramatically. So when looking at those things that influence kernel size, we look at a few different things. First off is genetics. Some hybrids just throw larger kernels. Now, if you're interested, I can actually send you a copy of the average kernel size of our hybrids. But even if you can genetically throw larger kernels, you need to fill these kernels. Now, this is where available moisture and available nutrients play a key role. Both of these items can be managed and need to be managed to maximize kernel size and therefore higher yields. Now, obviously, having irrigation helps to manage the available moisture part of this equation, but fertility is much more within our control on all of our acres. So I'm starting to see more and more nutrient deficiency symptoms showing up in our fields across the state, which is an indicator that those fields are not maximizing their kernel size potential this year. The part of this equation that is out of our control, of course, is day and night temperatures. And actually, in a study we performed, it showed that on the average across places like Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, we experienced 2.8 fewer bushels per acre for every 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in the months of July and August average minimum temperature. Plus, of course, increased night temperatures is usually accompanied by higher than average daytime temperatures, as well as some drier soil moisture levels. Not been a problem with us in most places this year. But because of this, it's difficult to look solely at historic temperature responses and separate out that overall influence of nighttime temperature. But it is something that can affect our yields at the end of the season. Therefore, as you're out doing these kernel counts and you're estimating yields across the farm these next few weeks, just be sure to take some extra time into determining the proper bottom number in that yield equation. It can make a huge difference in the accuracy of your yield estimates. So, with that, I hope you're recovering from any storm damage this week and otherwise just had a great week. This is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest Michigan agronomist with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday. Have a great weekend.